to give feedback on its use to hopefully make it stronger once we go or over time. So as Vicki mentioned, I've got up here with me Tom Dietrich, who is the project manager, and Melly Connect, who is the project engineer. They will both be speaking. As Vicki mentioned, my name is Mark McCabe, and I was the principal investigator for the project. I'd like to take just a quick second to thank the TAC for their contributions and their feedback and their guidance as we put this together. It was new for a lot of folks, and just by the turnout here, apparently it's necessary and of interest to a lot of folks. So hopefully you will find it as rewarding as we did once we got into it and started to develop the actual tool itself. Go ahead, Tom. So as an agenda, we're going to go through this somewhat systematically here. Project overview first, a real quick look at the objectives and some of the tasks and findings, and then we're going to look at the tool itself and spend time on how we put the tool together, what some of the research project or products were that helped create the tool, what some of the interim results were, how we used those. Then we'll get into the actual tool itself and the functionality, and we'll go through a demonstration of the tool with some screenshots to show you how it's intended to be used, and then give you some guidance on how to use it. Go ahead, Tom. So the goals. We started out to establish a methodology for recommending proven stormwater BMPs, but it was obvious to us early on that there was no silver bullet for this. Those that work in this field already know the challenges, and didn't take long to figure out very site-specific with respect to how you go about selecting, sizing, choosing, implementing, operating, and maintaining a post-construction water quality practice for any given project. So we started out almost in one dimension, I suppose you could say. When the RP was looking for a BMP matrix, and as we started to collect the information, both from a literature review, interviews, and case studies, it became obvious to us that there was a little more to offer with respect to just more or less the BMP one-dimensional matrix. So it evolved into a screening tool which requires some thought by the user to understand his or her project to the point where they can put in attributes that are project specific and then work through the screening questions to get the results at the end. This is not a magic bullet. You're going to have to know something about your projects or learn enough about your projects to input this information, and then you're still going to have to use best engineering or sound engineering judgment at the end with respect to making the selection of the choices. We've got in excess of 20 BMPs to look at in the tool offers. Some of these are compatible with L&D, some of them compatible with the construction general permit, and some of them offer alternatives. So we'll try to go through this systematically and tell you from a regulatory standpoint what's applicable. Once you step outside that regulatory arena, what may or may not be applicable and what you may have to do to follow that path if you so choose. So project overview, as I've alluded to a little bit here, we were looking at how do we get from A to B. So what is the issue? The issue is, how do we look at providing guidance, providing information to help a local engineer, county engineer, planner, what have you, look at selecting post-construction water quality best management practices. So the RFP asked us to look at both a rural and urban setting, and it became obvious to us we've got a suburban setting that we have to deal with, and then we have all the local issues. So we've really tried to take those four concepts or ideas and thread them into the screening tool as we ask a series of questions of the user to go through and prompt you to think about what the tool is, where it's going to sit, how it's going to look, how's it going to be maintained. We've got some sizing criteria and some tabs, and we've got some minimal costing criteria as well. So we had 6 tasks for this. I'm going to turn it over here in a second to Tom to talk about tasks 2 through 4. But these are research products that we pulled together. So Tom will talk about the interviews, he'll talk about the literature research, and he'll talk about the case studies. And then we'll pass it over to Melanie, and she'll spend the time to dissect the tool, walk you through it, what the functionality is and how to use it. And then I'll come back at the end to talk briefly about where do we go from here and what the expectations are. So, Tom?
Great. Hi, I'm Tom Dietrich with Gresham Smith & Partners. As Mark alluded to, I will be talking about tasks 2, 3, and 4 to start off with. Literature review, and as with any good research project, you have to start off with literature review. And all of our research efforts were headed toward developing this BMP tool. So that was our guiding direction for the literature review. And we used the team's research experience with NCHRP or ACRP and our work with the DOT to help guide us through this. We initially identified over 100 documents, stormwater BMP manuals, guidance documents, other research manuals, and even other BMP tools. So the outcome of the literature review, one of the documentation pieces was we developed a annotated bibliography, which, next slide here, there's a little screenshot of it. It's probably kind of hard to see in the room, but you can take a look, and the annotated bibliography is Appendix A of the final report. So it summarizes some of the key documents that we use in the literature review and has some highlights, so it could be a good reference for others that are doing research on BMPs.
This is Mark. Tom, if I could, I'd like to interject one thing here. With respect to the tool or to the literature that we were able to go through, we couldn't have done it without the support of Geosyntec and their experience with the international BMP database. That allowed us to filter some of this in a very streamlined, very efficient manner, and then bring to the table what we felt were 20 or more that had applicable use and that we could apply to Ohio-centric and Ohio-based weather, soils, and runoff and precipitation events.
Very good. Yes. So, as I mentioned, the annotated bibliography was Appendix A. The Appendix B was a summary of our key findings from the research, which directly drove developing the tool. First off, identifying the BMP set, which BMPs were we going to include in the tool. We settled on 23 BMPs that we incorporated in the tool. We evaluated those BMPs and their different design characteristics, limitations, and constraints, and used those to drive the development of the screening questions. And then took those, then developed, populated the detailed BMP matrix, which is the one table that has all of the BMP, the specific data and characteristics quantified there. And we'll talk more about that matrix as we go along. Another item that drove developing the tool and populating the tool were the stakeholder interviews. And we reached out to a broad array of different locals and other stakeholders across the state to identify lessons learned and make sure that the research product, as Mark mentioned, that this is it's supposed to be applied research, so we wanted the outcomes of the tool to be really applicable to our stakeholders. So we contacted over 30 local, county, township, city agencies, as well as ODOT staff and other BMP stakeholders. And ended up conducting 23 interviews, had very good success with participation in this effort. So that was great. And through the outcomes, through the key findings, that helped feed into development of the tool, as I mentioned. So things that bubbled up out of the research was that aesthetics of the BMPs were a key consideration for locals. So we ended up incorporating some questions about operations and maintenance and aesthetics in the screening questions. A couple other things themes that we found from the interviews were really more about BMP implementation. And so these were some of the items that we summarized in the final report. Let's see. these interview findings were incorporated in the screening questions. And so to develop the tools, that's what we're going to talk about. Developing the final tool, and another outcome of the research was 5 BMP case studies. I'm going to start with the case studies because we're going to then shift over to the tool and just finish off with the tool the rest of the time. So we, through the interview process, we also were contacting the stakeholders and asking them for potential BMP case studies. And we ended up identifying 5, a cross-section of BMPs that were bioretention, constructed wetland, manufactured device, which is a hydrodynamic separator, permeable pavement, and the vegetated swale. So these 5 seem to be the most representative of, or the most common, I'll say, potential case studies that would be helpful for locals looking at implementing BMPs. Each of the case studies had, basic project background, included site figures and photos, described the BMP function, and also the driver for what the need for the BMP was. Many of these BMPs were actually driven more by CSO, SSO, meeting green infrastructure requirements or trying to reduce combined sewer overflows, but some of them were more just trying to address the construction general permit, and that was our main driver in the tool, was to address the construction general permit. But we did leave some flexibility because we realized that the tool could be used outside of that as well. So Melanie will talk more about that later. So to develop the original tool, as Mark mentioned, it's really just a BMP matrix, just a list of BMPs with columns of the BMP characteristics to help make the decision. We built off of that and developed a stepwise screening tool that helps you narrow the field of potential BMPs as you go. So Melanie will talk more about that, but I'm just giving you a big overview of the concept. And we wanted to include, we realized through the interviews and with the stakeholders that regulatory applicability and understanding the regulations was kind of an opportunity to address that the locals needed some support in that. And so we built in 2 steps in the tool to help with that. One was just to screen if a BMP, if the general permit was even applicable. That's step 1, and then later on in the tool we provided a tool for calculating water quality volume and water quality flow. So that was an additional feature that we built into the whole tool rather than just a matrix. So this is just a figure to show that all of the work that we were doing through the research was driving at developing the BMP tool, using the outcomes of the interviews and the literature review to feed the development of the tool, and then using case study information to do verification and testing. A couple of big picture items I'll say. I know we're all anxious to get in and see what the tool looks like, but I just want to put out a couple of caveats about how to use it and things to consider when using it. The tool can, because it can only generate outcomes for one application at a time. So if your project encompasses multiple watersheds or drainage basins, you may have to use the tool more than once to come up with BMPs that address the different watersheds or different areas of a project. But you can just save as, use the tool save as, and generate multiple copies. As with any tool or model, the quality of the data that you put in is inherently connected to the quality of your output. So it's incumbent on the user to have some knowledge of the project, and so we're thinking around stage 1 design that you have enough information that you can answer some of the questions fill in the data and answer the screening questions sufficiently. If you get into the tool and you realize, well, I don't have all these answers, then you can just go back to your design process and get those answers, then come back to the tool. So it actually helps prompt the users to identify some of the key features for identifying, to get you to selection of a BMP. We realized through the stakeholder interviews that that was something that was lacking, that often the BMP selection was put off till the end of the project, leading to a lot of limited options and maybe even increasing your costs of the potential BMPs. Based on your responses, you can use the tool iteratively. So if you go through and enter your responses and your list of potential BMPs is too narrow, you can go back and adjust your responses and then open up more possibilities, or vice versa. And in the end, you'll come up with a list of potential BMPs. It's incumbent, again, on the user and the local engineer and designer to ultimately select which BMP is most applicable for you. So again, it's not a silver bullet. It helps screen out and identify potential BMPs and give the user the information needed to make the selection. So I'll just say a word about the detailed BMP matrix, and then we'll work into these other steps. This is a screenshot from the main menu of the tool. These are all hyperlinks. Each step in the first column shows the step number or reference, and those are all links that can help you navigate through the tool quickly. So let's talk about the BMP matrix, which I've already mentioned a couple of times. But this is really the basis for all the screening decisions. This is where all the data that, when you answer any of the questions of the screening steps, it's referring to the data in this BMP matrix. 23 BMPs in the rows and over 35 different characteristics of each BMP to help differentiate each of the BMPs to help you with your selection. I just want to put out a caveat that the values that were selected for the matrix should not be used as a reference for design purposes. These were values that were selected for screening. So if you so they're designed to help you differentiate the BMPs, not necessarily. You should not look at those and say, okay, depth of groundwater is X, minimum depth of groundwater. That's there are other references that we provide for that can be used for design purposes, but this is really about helping to identify and screen out BMPs. So with that, I will turn it over to Melanie to talk more about the BMP tool.
Okay. I'm Melanie Connect, and I'll be walking through the remaining steps. So starting with step 1, which is the regulatory applicability step that was mentioned earlier. So as we mentioned, this was added based on interview feedback, which suggested that there was some confusion over when the post-construction requirements actually apply. So we built this into the tool to ask some simple questions to the user to help determine if the post-construction requirements are applicable, as well as to determine if a routine maintenance exemption might apply and not require the post-construction BMP. The next step is step 2, and this step is actually not requiring any entry from the user. This is really just a review step that's introducing the 23 BMPs that are included in the BMP matrix, and we're providing them here to give the user an overview of their potential options before they begin the screening process. And we're introducing those in 4 different categories, and they've been grouped based on similar screening characteristics and to help you find particular BMPs in the table. And we've maintained that same order of BMPs you'll see repeated throughout the tool so you can find it and carry it through the screening process. Another note is that we've included BMPs from a couple different sets. We've included L&D standard BMPs as well as BMPs that are standard in the construction general permit. And then finally, we've included BMPs that are not standard in the permit, and those are included for situations where the user may have a site with more challenging characteristics and may be interested in pursuing a pre-approval from Ohio EPA to use an alternative BMP. So the next several steps all pertain to the screening process within the tool. There are 3 phases, and we'll walk through those. So this is an overview graphic showing the overall screening process. And as mentioned, there's three phases, and each phase is targeted at a particular topic that we're screening for. And it's a progressive screening process that gets more and more restrictive as you go through. So with each phase, the user is entering data pertaining to their project or site, and those are being compared to data for individual BMPs within the BMP matrix and being compared, and the list of BMPs is then being reduced based on what are compatible with the site. And the final product is a set of potential BMPs that you can consider for your site, and there's some more further information provided at the end of screening to help you screen those further. And as mentioned, if your set is too narrow, or if you think that it may be over-screening because your responses may have been too restrictive, you have the option to review how the screening was performed at each step and identify where you may want to go back and revisit some of your responses to make those less restrictive. Now we're zooming into one of the single screening phases, one of the 3 phases, and each step consists of actually an A step and a B step. And the A step is where the user enters information pertaining to their project or site in response to questions that are built into the tool. And some of those are just drop-downs where you're selecting a value from a list, and some of those are direct entry of data for the site. And then at this point, the tool is going to, in step B, take that information, compare it to each BMP in the matrix and the characteristics for those same questions, and find out where there are incompatibilities. And if there are any incompatibilities, then that BMP will be screened out of the process. So I'm going to be walking through each of the user data entry steps, the A steps, for each of the 3 screening phases, and then we'll touch on the screening results and analysis tabs. So the first phase of screening is focused on defining your initial BMP set, and that is done based on defining what methodology you're following. So are you following the L&D? Are you following the construction general permit? Are you willing to consider alternative BMPs? And what we're doing is allowing users to define those so that we can reduce the set. If you know already you want to have something that's pre-approved, then we'll screen out the BMPs that would require additional approvals. You can also answer questions to confirm if quantity and quality control requirements apply. And beyond that, we've included a function based on feedback from the TAC. We've added questions to ask the user about additional requirements and additional functions that their BMP might need to perform outside of the construction general permit. And that's primarily to allow users to specialize the screening process based on additional local stormwater manual requirements or stormwater ordinances. Some examples of that would be if a user needed to provide a BMP that could provide peak flow control for large storm events such as the 10-year storm or 100-year storm to match your post-development flow rates to pre-development flow rates. Or if you needed to provide runoff volume control to promote recharge, you could identify that. And again, these are just optional things that can be added. For quality, you can define specific pollutants that you need the BMP to control for, if that applies. If you are just following strictly the construction general permit, you can ignore these, but this allows you to have your BMP multitask and address multiple requirements at once. Moving on to phase 2 of screening, and this phase is primarily focused on technical feasibility for implementing a BMP at your site based on physical site characteristics. So this focuses on the footprint of the BMP and the space that you have available at your site, as well as some other criteria such as hydraulic drop, depth to groundwater, infiltration and soil characteristics, as well as means for getting the flow into your BMP. And we've also included safety as a major component of this phase based on feedback from interviews. So this would be allow you to specify any requirements that pertain to the specific location where your BMP is going to be installed. So if your BMP is going to be installed within the clear zone and you need to limit your ponding depth, you can specify that here. And as mentioned before you do this tab, it is asking some specific site questions. So you do want to have an idea of where your BMP would be installed, what area it would be serving, so that you can get more out of the tool. If you do not have the answers, you can leave some questions blank and it won't screen based on those, but you'll get less screening done and you'll end up with a larger BMP set at the end. Moving on to the final phase 3 of screening. And the user entry for this phase requires information about operations and maintenance constraints, as well as aesthetic preferences. So we have, it's important to note that we have not included the level of effort for O&M as a screening criteria. We felt that that would make it too restrictive because everyone's going to say low operations and maintenance and have a very small set of BMPs at the end. So we've left that out of the screening, but it is included later on. Once you perform the screening process, you can see that information. What we're asking here is more related to what types of equipment or staffing you might need to be able to implement the BMP successfully at your site. And for aesthetics, as mentioned, that was also very important to interviewees, particularly in urban environments where they may want a BMP that is subsurface or invisible to the public and can't be vandalized, or where there's just a preference for a particular aesthetic look. So now I'll move on to the B steps for the screening process, and all of these are set up very similarly, and I'll walk through an example. So in this step, for each question that is asked of the user, they fill in a response on the A tab, as mentioned before. And in this step, for each of those questions, that response is compared to a similar BMP-specific limitation that's in the BMP matrix. And if those results are incompatible, that BMP is shown as incompatible for that singular decision. And then overall, if there's any decision where the BMP shows up as incompatible, that BMP is screened out. And BMPs are only retained in the set in that screening phase if there are no incompatible decisions. And it's important to note that if it says compatible, it doesn't necessarily guarantee it's going to be compatible at your site. It just means that for that particular decision, your response is compatible with what the BMP allows. So this is a little bit small. We try to squeeze a lot on here, but this is a screen grab from one of the results tabs of the tool. This one is from phase 3. So in this case, just want to illustrate the information that we're showing here. And you'll see on the far left side, there's a full list of the 23 BMPs that are within the tool. This column here is actually, since it is a progressive screening process, it's showing you what were the screening results from the previous phase of screening. In this next step, before I move on, I just want to point out the color coding here. The beige color indicates the BMP was screened out at the previous step or during the current step, and that lavender color indicates that the BMP is retained within the data set at this point in the screening. This next column shows you the results of the screening decisions at this particular phase. So we've put these 3 summary columns here on the left to provide you an overview, but we've also included on the far right side a column for each of the individual screening decisions that's associated with that phase. And what this allows you to do is you can see at a glance which BMPs are ruled out based on this phase of screening. But if you want to know more information, you can track over to the columns on the right, and you can see where the BMP was ruled out or what the basis was for ruling out that BMP. So you can see, as an example, subsurface bed filters were ruled out at this phase as incompatible for the confined space entry requirements for that site, for the O&M constraints. And as a result, because there is a single incompatibility there, that BMP is ruled out as incompatible under overall Phase 3 screening assessment. And this next column is a compilation of all of the previous screening results and the current screening results. So you can see that there's a BMP here in the first group, subsurface flow wetland, that was screened out in previous phases, but none of the questions at this phase were incompatible. But since there was a question that was incompatible at a previous phase, it remains as screened out in this phase. And the only ones that remain in this phase then are ones that were compatible based on previous screening to this point, as well as compatible with the current phase. Moving on, and this is the final step in the screening process. This is where you can review your final results. And these three main columns in the center here show you the screening results from each of the three phases of screening, and I'll walk through those. So in this particular example, in Phase 1 of screening, you can see that there are 10 BMPs that remain as not being screened out in Phase 1. In Phase 2, we've now reduced that set to 6 remaining BMPs because there were several of these, the BMPs in Phase 1 were ruled out in Phase 2. And then in Phase 3, we've reduced that BMP set from 6 BMPs down to 4 BMPs. And at this point, you've got several BMPs you could potentially choose from, and we've provided these additional columns at the far right to assist with further screening and selection. So this is where we're providing the O&M level of effort, and we're providing that here as low, medium, or high based on level of man hours. And then we've also provided a capital cost range for the BMPs, and those are ranging from $1 sign to $4 signs, and those are defined within the tool. So you can see for these 4 BMPs remaining at the end of Phase 3, there are 2 BMPs that have low level of effort for O&M, 2 BMPs have high level of effort remaining. And of the 2 that have low level of effort, there's one with $1 sign, one with $2 signs. So you could use that if you wanted to go with the lowest level of effort and cost. You could look at the vegetated filter strip first and verify that that is appropriate for your site. Or you could look at these other options as well. Now, in some cases, you might not end up with 4 remaining. You could end up with 1 remaining or none remaining, potentially, if there's overscreening. And the reason why we provided the results for each phase of screening is that so you can see where did the majority of BMPs get screened out. In this case, we've gone from 10 to 6 in Phase 2, so if there's a particular BMP you're considering at your site, you could see where it was screened out and then go back and revisit your responses to that particular phase. And on that phase, you could even see what question it was screened out based on. So now I'll be walking through a demonstration of the tool functionality. And we've tested the tool based on several different sample projects from around Ohio. And I'm going to present some questions and results for each phase of screening, but just it should be noted that these are made, this is a compilation of several different projects, so this is not one project carried all the way through, but we wanted to illustrate some different points with each of these projects. This first project is an ODOT project in a rural area, and it's for Phase 1. Some of the interesting points are that it's following L&D methodology. It does require quantity and quality control to be provided, and it doesn't have any additional applicable local stormwater requirements or additional functions that the BMP needs to provide beyond those required by the construction general permit. This is a screen grab from one of the A steps of screening. This is an abbreviated version because we can't fit the whole thing on here, but just wanted to show you how this is set up and what it looks like. So these are 2 of the questions from the screening phase, and I'll walk through some further information here. At the top of this tab and all of the tabs of the tool, this black box provides some links to help you navigate through the tool. At any step, you can always use the top link to return to the main menu, and you can use that main menu that we've showed you before that looks like a rainbow to navigate between the different steps of the tool. There's also a next button and a previous button at the top, so you can flip between steps pretty easily. And then finally, since it is set up in Excel, everything's on a separate tab, and you can use the tabs at the bottom of the screen to jump between different steps of the process. We've also provided guidance within each step, and that's in this pale yellow color. You'll see guidance at the top of each tab that introduces, here's what this tab is for, here's how you'll use it. And then for each question, the questions are here in white, and you'll see on the far right it provides some guidance on how you might respond to the question or further clarification on how to interpret what the question is asking. And the green boxes here are boxes that require direct entry from the user. And these may be either drop-down boxes, and it'll say drop-down when you first open the tool, or a direct user entry. In this example, everything here is a drop-down. And we've also incorporated some features where, in this particular example, some of the questions become irrelevant depending on some of your previous questions and responses. So in this case, it asks if the user is following the L&D manual. They say yes. So some of these other questions related to the construction general permit are no longer applicable, and those get grayed out for you so you can skip over those. Each set of questions is labeled with a step number, and it should be noted that those are also carried through to each of the screening results tabs, so you can coordinate the question number with where it got screened out, and you can find out where your responses are for that particular question. And then there's a legend at the bottom of each tab that provides a reminder of what the cells mean. I also want to point out that on this particular phase, there is some feedback that the tool is giving you that's shown in these blue cells. And for example, in this case, it's just providing you a summary of what data was collected based on your responses. On the regulatory applicability tab, we use those blue boxes as well, and it reports back some assessment of whether the post-construction requirements are applicable or not. So here are the results for phase 1 for this particular project, and you can see that the majority of the questions were not found to be incompatible in this case, but most of the screening, all of the screening in this particular phase was based on the methodology and the need to provide both quantity and quality control per the L&D. So the only BMPs remaining at this step are the ones that are listed in the L&D as meeting the quantity quality control requirements. For screening phase 2, some interesting characteristics. It's a somewhat small tributary area, very low hydraulic drop available at the site. It's got poor soils for infiltration, requires pipes or channels to drain to the BMP, and permeable pavement was listed as not acceptable for this particular project, and permanent pools are not allowed. Again, similar screen, just showing you some sample questions, and just wanted to point out on this tab that you'll see an example here where the user did not respond to the question, and that's okay. If you don't have this information, like I said before, you don't have to respond to it. You can leave it blank. You just won't have screening performed based on that particular question. So in this phase, this is kind of a compilation of columns here. So we tried to show you the columns where screening was being performed. And in this case, because of those criteria that were specified, there's screening being performed in a variety of different categories here, including tributary area, permeable pavement, hydraulic drop, and so on. And you can see we've gone from 7 or so BMPs remaining after phase 1 to only 1 BMP remaining after phase 2. And in this case, you're carrying over only 1 BMP over to phase 3. So I would suggest in this case going back and just confirming that your questions are not more restrictive than you intend them to be, because you're not leaving yourself with a very big data set. So for phase 3, this is the screening phase that focuses on O&M resources and as well as aesthetics. And in this case, there were multiple resources available for O&M. That didn't seem to be a large constraint. And the user specified that the BMP needs to be vegetated with turf grass or sod instead of native vegetation. And the BMP is not required to be subsurface. So this screening phase is fairly concise and short. But in this example, there were 3 BMPs remaining after phase 2, and there were only 2 BMPs that were screened out in phase 3, but those were ones that were already screened out. So there's still 3 BMPs remaining at the end to choose from: underground detention, dry extended detention basin, and permeable pavement extended detention. And then finally, here's the final results screen for one of the examples. And as mentioned before, this is one where we've got 7 or so BMPs remaining after phase 1. We've dropped down to only 1 BMP in phase 2, and that carries through to phase 3. And in this case, you're left with 1 BMP. It has a medium level of effort for O&M and medium to high cost range. So if that is not compatible with your needs for your project, you may want to go back and revisit. Phase 2, it looks like there were a variety of BMPs screened out. So you may want to go back and check to see if there was one response you gave that maybe you weren't so certain about the response based on where you're at in the project design, and maybe you could consider some different characteristics of being a little bit less restrictive with that. And I'll pass it back to Mark to wrap up.
Thanks, Melanie. So as we finish with this, we indicated that we're going to make it available, so you can see the website where it's going to be posted on, and there will be a form available once you start to use it and interact with it. So we would encourage all the feedback. As we said, we've test-driven it, but probably not as robust as we could have. We tried to do a range of testing with some of the folks that were on the TAC committee, but it definitely is probably needs a little more driving and a little more diversity with some project complexities. A survey will be distributed via an email to get feedback on the usefulness, additions, and then not sure where we're going to go from here. There could be possible training, how to use this. Right now there is no guidance out there, written guidance on how to use it. This is as close as we have come. That was not part of our scope to develop any written guidance on the use of it, but training could be a possibility if the demand is there. And the final report, along with the executive summary and the tool itself, will be made available through this link and through this website. So with that, I think we're done, and we will take questions. So what I'm going to do on the questions, I'll have to probably repeat the question so that everybody can hear it that's on the webinar, so hopefully it's not too long and I can remember what you asked. Go ahead.
Is the tool going to be downloadable, or do you have to use it online?
So the question was, is the tool going to be downloadable, or are you going to have to use it online? So right now it is meant to be a standalone tool, and you will take it and use it. And as we said, one of the caveats is you'll have to use it, each BMP that you want to assess or project area, each watershed or drainage area, you have to use it again and again and again. It's not going to be able to differentiate and subdivide throughout the whole project. You're going to have to systematically use it and walk through. So go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, so it's a Microsoft Excel that you would download and use.
Yeah. And it'll be posted as a version that is clean, so it doesn't have any data entered in it right now. It'll have just blank cells, and we would encourage you to download that, save a copy as a template for future uses, and you can just clone that off and save it for different applications needed.
And there is some intelligence there. I mean, there is, as Tom had said, it is conservative on some of the numbers. So if you're going to use it and build in your own design guidance, whether it's a municipality, village, or city, if you so choose to do that, you're going to break some of the, potentially break some of the linkages. So just be forewarned that it's all loops, and it does go back to that BMP data sheet with all the intel in it is really the brains of the whole operation there. But again, we couldn't develop one that incorporated all city and entities' design requirements. So we had to start more generic. But the hope is that as you move through this and use it, that you can start to tailor it and build that thread into it.
You want to take one from online? Yeah. Okay, so there's a question from one of the webinar attendees. How did you define your O&M effort? What is low, medium, and high? So those are all obviously relative values. I'll just say a word about this because as Melanie mentioned, we didn't want to screen based on O&M effort and cost, because everyone wants the lowest maintenance, the lowest cost. So we took that as a given, that that's what you would want. We didn't want to screen for those characteristics. So we provided those at the end for you to compare and make your own selection. The reason we kept things relative like this in low, medium, high, and in the dollar signs for the costs in cost ranges is because there's a lot of flexibility in design, and the particular site specifics will drive the maintenance and drive the actual construction costs. So that's part of the answer is the low, medium, high. And so they're all relative to each other, and there's a table in Appendix B that describes, well, all of Appendix B. If you're interested in the values in the BMP matrix, I would refer you to that, because there's a thorough explanation of all the values there and tables that show the development of these, but it's all based on staff hours for the O&M. So that's the low, medium, high. Again, they're based on relative to each other. Should we look at any others from in the house? Or we'll scroll down here. Next. Okay. I noticed some additional BMPs, such as friction course and permeable shoulders. Are those new BMPs to be added to the L&D manual? You want to take that one?
So as we alluded to, when we started out to tackle this, we were given some direction through the RFP that we had to look at the L&D BMPs as well as what was in the construction general permit here in Ohio, and as well as others that would be more Ohio-centric. And between the research, the literature review, and the case studies, those really drove the evolution of the BMPs that are in the tool today. So to answer the question, right now we're not advocating that we're going to promote anything from the tool to get into either the L&D or become a discussion, with the regulatory agency. I do think this is the first step towards moving that direction. As part of the discussion throughout the development of this tool, the Department of Transportation is interested in the outcome of this, and they're still trying to get a handle on how they're going to use it and what they're going to use it for. But, we did learn throughout the course that there's an interest to expand the current suite of tools in L&D, as well as look at other BMPs that could be added to the Construction General Permit Table 2 over time. So your feedback in what you're using is only going to help that discussion and help hopefully expand both the L&D suite of tools as well as the Construction General Permit Table 2 tools.
Okay, any other questions from in the room? There was a question about the access to the report and to the tool, and Vicki responded to that on the chat box, but I'll just mention that the link that was posted in the last slide, previous slide, there, those have not been posted there yet. They will be by early next week. So everything it's not at the link right now, so you have to wait till next week. Okay. The cost for extended wet basin seemed high. Did that assume right-of-way acquisition in the cost? No, that did not include any additional right-of-way acquisitions. I think if there's anything else we can say about that. Okay. Okay, who were the interviews with? Sorry, this is jumping around on me. Who were the interviews with? What information was gleaned from them?
So when we started out, we wanted, as Tom alluded to, we wanted to have a cross-section. So we were we reached out to city or village engineers, county engineers, township superintendents or roadway superintendents, district DOT folks, academics with respect to working in this arena, whether it be, water quality or best management practices. And then we also had some private consultants as well that were on the interview list. So we had a range of about 35 folks we reached out to, and we were able to schedule and conduct interviews with 23 of them. And I believe as part of the appendix in the report, you can see the questions that were asked as well as the responses, and then the summary of findings. For those, because those were interesting results from those 23 interviews, is it possible to, off the top of your head, say anything that, any of the big conclusions that came out of that? I know some of them were mentioned in the presentation, but as far as what the interviewees thought was missing most or wanted most out of this research? So the question is, what were some of the highlights of the interviews that were conducted? So we had, probably one of the most, evident was the fact that we went back in as a part of the interview and added the regulatory component to the tool. There was still some misunderstanding and confusion on how to interpret that. The other was, where is there guidance in the state on how to do this? And they were familiar with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources rainwater lane development, but what else was out there? They were really looking for some guidance with respect to giving them some direction on how to select size practices to put in roadway projects. So there was a want there. They would really like something like that. There was also a want for, how do you go about selecting in the process with an urban setting versus a more suburban versus a more rural setting? Is the process the same? The tools or practices that are available the same throughout those 3 or 4 different settings? And then probably the one that was probably most thought-provoking was the aesthetics. How does it look when it gets in the ground? Not so much, it wasn't the vandalizing that was the issue, it's how it's going to look. If I have an open ditch and I'm going to put something in that ditch and it's going to look different than my neighbor's ditch, is that really what we want to be looking at? So aesthetics really was probably the most eye-opening. Anything to add, Tom?
There was a significant concern about operations and maintenance that came up, but so that's why one of the reasons we included that as a reference. Anything else?
An emphasis on safety and aesthetics, as Mark said, because with the aesthetics issue, we had gotten some feedback from some of the interviewees that when the public was not accepting the BMPs, then they were getting rid of the BMPs, or they were mowing vegetation that wasn't supposed to be mowed, and so we found that selecting a BMP that has aesthetics that are in line with the particular application was an important key to successfully implementing and maintaining the BMP in the long run.
Right. Another thing that came out of the interviews, and this latest question reminded me of that, was, and we mentioned it before, why we added the BMP, or the regulatory applicability step, was that is somewhat confusing and difficult to manage, and that even identifying the applicability, and then also how to comply with it. So that's why we added the BMP sizing tool, or there's tabs that help the user to calculate water quality flow and water quality based on either following the ODOT L&D or following the general methodology for the construction general permit. So those are in there, and that also, the intent and the hope was that will help to streamline the process for locals and help provide a more regular or a more common basis or methodology for all to follow. So it might help with statewide. will the tool report include, oh wait, I think I skipped one. Would the report have BMP matrix and its values? So the BMP matrix is within the tool, and all the values are within the tool, but there are tables, reference tables in the final report in Appendix B that talk about the findings from the literature review, and that cites the whole methodology for how we developed those and selected those values, as well as the actual values themselves. So often it'll even show what were the range of values from the literature, and then what is the value we selected for the screening criteria. So.
And then along with that, we added some detail with respect to the link. There's a link there if you're interested in that practice or that set of criteria, where we got that from, so you can go look up the full resource itself and dig into it as much as you want, if that is something that's appealing to you. We couldn't do that in the basis of the tool, but we do have that as a sort of guidance if you want to dig in as deep as you want to on any given practice.
Okay, we got that one. Is the intent? Yes, we got that one. Will the tool report include explanations for the O&M and cost rate rankings? So the tool itself has a reference to what those high, medium, low, how it just references the, let's see, actually the tool doesn't, it just lets you high, medium, low is just high, medium, low. But for the dollar values, it does state what those ranges are. So $1 sign is $5,000 or less per acre treated. And then, you know, the ranges go up to 15,000, 30,000, and above 30,000. So those are the $4 sign ranges. But again, the definition of how we arrived at those is all explained in Appendix B of the final report. Will updating the tool be the responsibility of the user? For instance, updating intensity values.
Would you like for me to take that one?
Sure,
Yes,
Vicki.
please. That was actually a question that we posed to the Technical Advisory Committee and to ODOT and the ORIL board. So that's why Vicki's going to take this one.
Okay, the BMP tool is one of the first deliverables from the ORIL program that's actually something you can use right away in your day-to-day work. And the way that it's been decided to approach updating the tool is it's going to be based upon how often is it used. Is there a need for it? Is there a desire for it? If you as locals, you can go and use this tool as much as you want, as little as you want. It is for you. It's yours. Once it's posted, there will be an email that will be sent out. The ORIL website will send it out, and LTAP will also send out a notification to anyone who's on that listserv letting you know it's up, it's ready, it's available. Use it to your heart's content. As Mark mentioned during his presentation, it's going to be housed on the ORIL website. On there will be a place where you can fill out a form if you've got questions about things you're trying to use the tool for, if you're having difficulties with the tool. If there's a lot of interest and a lot of use, there will be additional training that could be developed and offered. And as time goes on, BMPs change, new technologies become available. If there is enough desire from the local community to update the tool, the board will consider doing a new research study aimed at upgrading the tool, updating it with the latest and greatest information, and seeing if there are any features that have been asked for a lot that the current tool doesn't have you'd like to see added into it. So basically the answer to how often is it going to be updated, as often as you guys as locals here in Ohio demand that it gets updated. Okay, yeah, if you're online and you've got a question, you don't feel like typing it all the way out, press *6 to unmute your line and just speak up really loud. Do we have any other questions here in the room right now?
So you had mentioned that in the interviewees, they had requested guidance for design of BMPs that were outside of the state available guidance in the L&D and the Rainwater and Land Development Manual. So obviously this tool stops short of full design manual, that would have been much larger if it looked at selection. So is there anything that came out of this research that if someone wanted to look at a design of a BMP that was not in the L&D or the Rainwater Land Development Manual, so didn't have state-specific design guidance, where they could go to start with, maybe somewhere in the annotated bibliography or something?
Yes. Yes, so the annotated bibliography would be a fine place to begin. Let's see, maybe we should scroll back to that slide, because, sorry, don't get dizzy, but I'm going to go back to that annotated bibliography slide because it shows that we put in some screening categories, whoops, keywords here, so DOT, methods and tools, selection, site constraints, maintenance. So these are some keywords that you can reference. Thank you. Keywords that you can reference to help when you're screening or looking through the annotated bibliography. This will help give you some guidance as to what the references actually are discussing.
So you can see what the design methodology is for another BMP that might have BMP if Ohio doesn't.
Yes, so this one would say, it would actually say design in there, which it doesn't, but it says site constraints. So this is how we found some of those data values that we use for the BMP matrix. Additionally, so that would be the first place to look. In the other research products, I would say, again, I'd refer you back to Appendix B, because there's additional references in that section that weren't in the annotated bibliography. We did the annotated bibliography to help us drive the direction of the research, but in the end, we realized we needed to go back and identify additional information to help populate the tool. But those are all documented there. Anyone online have a question? I think,
Okay, if there's no more questions at this time, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I'm going to advance the slides quick again, so again, don't get dizzy. To the one that has the links on it. By early next week, both the final report and the tool itself will be available online. You can go down and download it to your computer, use it as many times as you want. If you have any other questions that you come up with later on, please feel free to email those to the ORIL email account. It's on the screen. For those of you who are participating and you are a local in Ohio, we encourage you to become more active in the ORIL program. You're getting first-hand knowledge. Tomorrow, ORIL officially opens its idea solicitation period for fiscal year 2017. That's where this idea for this stormwater project came from. That's how this tool got created. That's how you as locals got access to these experts at GS&P and geosynthetic at no cost to you, because ORIL covers the bill for that. So I encourage you to go check out the website. It's at the same link where you'll be able to get the final report in the tool for. There'll be a link there tomorrow letting you know how you can submit an idea. If you have any questions about either this project or anything related to ORIL, our phone number and email also are on that website. You can feel free to give us a call. We have attempted to record this presentation. If the recording went successfully, probably in about a week, we should also have a link to a YouTube recording of this presentation. You can feel free to send it to your friends, your colleagues, or just people you don't like, anybody you'd like to share it with. At that point, I thank you all for participating. Those of you online, you're free to log off, and we thank you very much.
Thank you all.